Welcome to Module 6.2. In this module, we'll explore how transparent and translucent objects can be rendered in Paint. For this section, I will provide a short explanation on how translucent and transparent objects interact with light, then provide two short demos. The first demonstration will show how to paint a clear glass container. The second will go into a more intricate painting demonstration with colored glass. Painting glass is easier than one might think. Like most aspects of painting, rendering glass is a matter of looking carefully at what is in front of you. By observing the minute areas of reflection and refraction in your subject, you will be able to create a believable glass surface with paint. Refraction is how light travels through a translucent or transparent object. In this image, we can see how two different bottles of the same shape and size refract light differently. One is filled with water and the other is empty. Note how the empty bottle has sharper and more complex caustics than the one filled with water. The empty bottle scatters the light, while the filled bottle concentrates its light more like a lens. This scattering of the light is what's known as a caustic. A drinking glass or a water-filled vase can act like a lens to focus light rays into spots or lines of light. Caustics are the spots or arcs or wavy bands of light projected onto surfaces by means of refraction or reflection from curved glass. In these images, several glasses of different shapes are set up in a direct light. Note how the difference in the shapes causes different caustic projections. The containers are bending or refracting the light, essentially acting as imperfect lenses. The light focuses and forms lines of concentration along boundaries of geometric shapes, sometimes with spectral effects along the edges. The caustic effects cluster inside cast shadows of the glass. In this way, they become part of the anatomy of a shadow. The shapes are determined by the curvature of the surface. Furthermore, transparent objects act differently if they are filled with liquid, as liquid can act as a lens. In this image, you can see how the mug behind the glass is refracted only slightly in the empty section of the glass. However, the water refracts the image of the mug, so the handle appears to emerge from the left side. You can see this in another way if I place the glass in front of a cutting mat. Notice how the cutting mat is straight, with the gridded lines staying parallel to each other. However, the liquid inside the glass refracts the image, reversing it and warping it. Now that I understand the basic underlying aspects of glass, I will begin by painting my glass of water. I begin by drawing the glass. At this stage, I make sure my ellipses are accurate. As I draw, I pay attention to the refractions and the shapes they make within the form. Note that the line from the table the glass is sitting on will appear curved within the glass if it is filled with a translucent liquid. As I do in every painting, I begin with the background and foreground, saving the subject for last. As I normally do, I'm working dark to light. I'm focusing on the places where the shadows are the most concentrated, such as the thicker parts of the glass and the edges of the water. These parts won't be completely black, but they will be the darkest parts of your painting. Now that I've laid my darks out, I'm going to be focusing on the main hues within the glass. The water will be a little lighter as it is trapping and scattering the light source. With transparent objects in front of a white wall, the color of the object will always be grayer than the wall. This is because the light is scattering through the material of the glass. With colored glass in front of a white background, the glass will be a mixture of the local color of the object and the background's white. If painting colored glass in front of a colored background, the resulting mixture will be of the two colors. Here I'm defining the edge of the glass. I'm also defining certain shapes. Notice how the water has a distinct line extending past the smaller ellipse that is the surface of the water. The darker line is the refraction, while the smaller ellipse is the liquid being contained by the sides of the thick glass. I'm now focusing on the refractions within the water. I'm blending some of the lighter color within the bottom half of the glass into the sharper edges of the side. At this stage, I'm working on some of the final details before I move into the highlights. At this stage, I'm finally adding the highlights. Because most glass has a high gloss or a shiny finish, highlights will be sharp. Only add highlights to parts of the glass that are facing the light source. I'm placing a highlight on the back rim because the glass is not blocked by anything and therefore reflecting the light source. Finally, I'm using just a little bit of dry brush for some final scattered highlights. In all, this sketch took me about 30 minutes. Once you understand what you're looking for, painting glass will take you no time at all. Most of the illusion comes from believable values, color, highlights, and refracted shapes. With these ideas in mind, let's try something more difficult. I'll be painting this complex arrangement of green bottles in front of a white background, with its packaging to the side. Most of the bottles are empty, save for the one on the far right, which is filled with soda. I've removed the labels to better observe the glass. I don't want to get bogged down trying to get the graphics of the label correct. In Module 5.1, I went over the basics of perspective. This will come in handy when I'm trying to draw my bottles. You can find the horizon line by looking at how narrow your ellipses are. I've noticed the horizon line is near the top of my composition, and that will dictate how my ellipses will look. The ones at the bottom will be wider than those closer to the horizon line, which will be narrower. The ones above the horizon line will then start getting a little wider as they travel away from that line. I then continue establishing where my ellipses are in the background. While I may not see them in total, understanding where they are in relation to the foreground will help me better understand how the background influences the foreground's translucent forms. Begin with a value study. This time I'm using a gray wash to demonstrate how it would look if you were to execute it this way. You can use whatever technique you'd like to establish your values. Then you move on to your underpainting. I'm using a red underpainting as my main subject is green. Your underpainting color may differ depending on the main color of your composition. Remember, underpaintings like this are usually complements of your main subject. Do note, however, if your subject is mostly off-whites, please do not use black. As always, paint your background first. It'll help you block in your shapes, and it's easier to correct your background if you make a mistake. If you paint your subjects first and then apply a background, you run the risk of painting over them by accident. It's also a good way to define your areas. Now I'll apply my darks. Here you can see how painting a complement as your base helps the vibrancy of your hues. The opposition color theory suggests that your eye's cones become overloaded when seeing two hues opposite on the color wheel. This makes the colors seem to vibrate. Now I'll start applying my midtones, which are far more saturated. Here you can see opposition color theory in play. The saturated midtone seems far more vibrant than if it were applied over a white surface. At this stage of the composition, I formed most of the shapes in the bottles by using my darks and my mids. I have carefully observed hard edges versus soft edges within the forms of the bottles. Understanding how light travels through transparent and translucent objects tells me what to look for when applying these shapes and colors. For some of the darker hues, I've added just a little bit of my cadmium red to my blue and green mixture. Adding a complement while mixing will desaturate the color while still keeping the hue within its color range. This works differently than oppositional color theory, as it is the pigments that are being mixed and not the pure saturated colors. Understanding how forms appear when seen through transparent or translucent objects will help when trying to portray the bottles in the background. Here you can see the hard lines within the middle of the bottles in the foreground. Because there is no liquid within the bottles, the forms are simply skewed rather than completely distorted. However, the bottle full of liquid is acting a little differently than the glass from the first part of the module. The container as well as the liquid inside are more opaque than the glass from the first demonstration. While working with a broader range of colors, it's always best to check your mixtures. The bottle in the background I noticed was a little too yellow. It was the wrong hue and I needed to correct it. By using a separate scrap piece of paper and checking your color mixtures, you can achieve more believable hues. At this time in the painting, I began working on the packaging. I had forgotten to add color cast onto it from the bottles at the beginning, so I did a quick wash to establish where the light transmitted from the bottles would be. A quick wash is not enough for a fully rendered painting, however. I'm going back in and re-establishing the defined areas of color. Because the light cast onto the packaging is a mix of the local color of the package and the light cast from the bottles, it will be a mixture of both. The red on the label will be a mixture of my cadmium red and my green. This mix will create a reddish gray. However, because of simultaneous contrast, the viewer's eye will interpret it as a saturated red but in green light. Furthermore, the white will be a mix of white and green. I was saving the tops of the bottles to execute last. Because they're complicated shapes, I wanted to make sure I had the rest of the composition covered before I tackled these. Because we're painters and not photographers, we need to only provide a suggestion of the shape of the bottle tops. By squinting, I can notice the broad shapes within the forms, and this will provide an adequate amount of information for the viewer. Due to the time constraints of this project, I'm giving an impression of the shape rather than articulating every thread of the top perfectly. Keep in mind, we're only trying to convey and describe a form rather than completely depict it. Describing the object believably enough to the viewer will require me to focus on one part at a time. Consider this the texture phase of the painting. Work dark to light, slowly building up darks as a base and then add your mids. It's only at the end of the painting that I decide to work on my highlights. Every other aspect of the painting has more or less been resolved. As I gave myself only 5 hours to paint this subject, I had to work fairly quickly and omit some minute details. I wanted to include the logo as it was striking, but it was not my main point of interest, so I more described it than rendered it photorealistically. I also avoided complete articulation of the raised surface of the glass bottles. Certain information is embossed in the glass, but I decided to describe it through highlights, generalizing the shapes. I'm using a light green rather than straight white. This will help build up the highlight. Only use absolute white as a final finishing touch and use it sparingly. Consider this the texture phase of the painting. Remember, with texture, a little goes a long way. And with those final touches, I'm finally finished. Through my understanding of translucent objects and perspective, I was able to, in 5 hours, create a painting of 6 bottles in a fairly believable space. With the information in this module and your knowledge of perspective, you will be able to create a painting with believable objects yourself. This concludes Module 6.2. For this module's assignment, create your own painting using glass. Find a 6-pack of anything you'd like as long as the bottles are transparent or translucent. The bottles must be either glass or plastic. You can include other objects in your composition as long as you have at least 3 bottles. To make the assignment easier, you may take the labels off or generalize the colors on the logos. Do not feel compelled to paint the graphics. For more information, visit the assignment portal on Canvas